welcome. Thank you for joining us for the kickoff of the why and how of measuring access to opportunity. We're very excited about this session with all of you. My name is Rayla Bellis. I'm a program manager with Smart Growth America. We are a national nonprofit. This afternoon, we will be discussing a new resource created by the Governor's Institute on Community Design. You can download this new guide on our website at the link you see on this slide here. We're going to be recording this session, so you can listen in after the fact. Just a little bit about the Governor's Institute on Community Design. We're a program of Smart Growth America based in Washington, D.C. that advises governors and state legislators as they seek to guide growth and development in their state leaders, we bring together practitioners and academics in the fields of government, design, development, regional economics to help states' executive teams make informed choices about their future. In practice, this typically takes the form of a workshop for governors' cabinets and lead policy staff. But we're also increasingly working with state departments of transportation through the Governor's Institute on Community Design. The Governor's Institute is a partnership between Smart Growth America as well as our federal partners at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Department of Transportation. And this new guide that we're going to be talking about today was supported by the Federal Highway Administration as well as U.S. EPA. We're going to have some time for question and answer at the end of our session, so I'd encourage you to type your questions into the chat box in the bottom right, or the bottom left of your screen, and we will add them to our list of questions for the end of this discussion. And our speakers this afternoon, this is us, myself, that's me there, Rayla Bellis, a program manager with Smart Growth America, and I'm joined by Beth Osborn, a senior policy advisor with Transportation for America, as well as Lynne Peterson, a senior policy advisor for Smart Growth America. But first, we're going to be hearing from the Federal Highway Administration about the federal role and performance-based planning and some of the impetus for this work and this guide that we produced. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Wesley Blunt with the Office of Planning, Environment, and Realty at FHWA to say a few words. Wesley?
Yes, thank you, Rayla. Again, my name is Wesley Blunt, as Rayla just mentioned, and I am with the Livability Team in the Office of Human Environment at Federal Highways. First of all, let me just say good afternoon, and I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We also would like to thank the Governor's Institute for Community Design and Smart Growth America for their efforts in organizing this webinar. Over the past 2 decades, transportation agencies have increasingly been applying performance management, which is a strategic approach that uses performance data to support decisions to help achieve desired performance outcomes. Performance-based planning and programming refers to the application of performance management within the planning and programming processes of transportation agencies to achieve desired performance outcomes for a multimodal transportation system. Beginning with MAP 21 and carried through the FAST Act, states and MPOs are required to set targets and develop performance measures to advance their transportation systems. GICD organized 2 workshops that focused on transportation performance measures, tools, examples, and methodologies. Representatives from the transportation agencies participated by sharing their experiences, and we would like to thank them for all their insightful inputs. The guidebook that GICD has developed will give states and MPOs a resource to go beyond the traditional measures to improve both connectivity and multimodal needs. If you have not reviewed the guidebook, it highlights the data, tools, and methodologies transportation officials may want to use to supplement the FAST Act work and leverage transportation to achieve community outcomes in areas such as job access, health, and quality of life. The GIC guidebook also highlights a number of federal highway resources to support multimodal outcomes, including but not limited to our performance-based planning and programming guidebook, which describes a performance-based planning process along with examples of effective practices to help practitioners advance these approaches in their own planning and programming activities. The second one is the guidebook for developing path-bike performance measures, which highlights a broad range of ways that walking and bicycling investment, activity, and impact can be measured, and documents how these measures relate to goals identified in the community's planning process. And we are continuing to advance this work as it relates to bike path network connectivity, multimodal performance, safety, and performance-based planning with projects such as our Measuring Multimodal Network Connectivity project that will synthesize and present the full range of options available for measuring network connectivity and tracking change over time. This project, anticipated for release in the fall of 2017, will include 5 case study communities. In closing, if you have any questions about performance-based planning or our multimodal resources, or if you would like additional assistance, please contact your Federal Division Office or any of our Federal Highway team participating today for assistance. Again, thank you for your participation, and we hope that this will be a learning experience for all. Back to you, Rayleigh.
Excellent. Thank you, Wesley. So I'm going to build on what Wesley began to talk about and tell you a little bit about how we developed this guide before we go into what you can find in it. The GICD team began by conducting a scan of how agencies and private and nonprofit organizations around the country are currently measuring access to opportunity, and we're going to talk in a second about what exactly we mean by that, including tools available to do so and typical data sources used. We also conducted interviews with, with transportation agencies around the country that are already starting to measure access to opportunity and to learn why they're doing so and how they're using the results of that performance measurement. We had an advisory panel as well of practitioners and experts that provided feedback on the guide at key stages during its development, which included representatives from state departments of transportation, MPOs, and local DOTs and transit agencies. And then we also, as Wesley said, conducted a couple of multi-state workshops to discuss best practices in this area. This was during 2016, and collect feedback on draft versions of our guidebook. So this guide went through several rounds of feedback and iterations to try and hopefully make it as valuable and relevant as possible to the practitioners doing this work. We're going to talk in a few minutes, like I said, about what information you can find in the guide, and I'll walk through it. But first, we wanted to provide some background about why we at the Governor's Institute think this is an important topic. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Beth Osborn to introduce herself and talk a little bit about this.
Hi, I'm Beth Osborn. I'm Senior Policy Advisor here at Smart Growth America, and I am going to talk about why we're talking about performance measures at all, particularly access to opportunity. We have a long history of measuring the performance of the transportation system, but there are certain things that we have measured very carefully, and there are other things that we have talked about generally without putting numbers to. In the past, we have measured pavement condition and bridge condition. We do some extensive measurement about the safety of a roadway, particularly documenting where there are crashes and particularly fatalities. We've measured transit ridership. There's been some attempts at measuring traffic flow and roadway capacity, particularly when we design our roadways, we think about what we expect the capacity to be, and when we find breakdowns, that's generally how we identify where new investment needs to occur. In MAP 21, which was the reauthorization bill passed in 2012, Congress took the federal programs and they streamlined them into simpler, broader programs for the states to manage with wide eligibilities that the states could target the funding to local and state needs. However, Congress said along with that streamlining and broader eligibility would come some accountability for the results of the program and the spending. So they instituted a system of performance management that has just reached its final stage and will be implemented in the very near future as of the final rulemakings that were published in the Federal Register in January. There are a set of measures that Federal Highways manages. There's a set that the Federal Transit Administration manages, and I will also mention related ones that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration also manages. Federal Highways has the broadest view. They will be requiring states and metropolitan planning organizations to measure fatalities and serious injuries on roadways, congestion, pavement condition and bridge condition on the NHS and on the interstates, and freight movement on the interstates, mobile source emissions, and the reliability of the interstates and the national highway system. The Federal Transit Administration will require transit authorities to measure the safety and the state of repair of their transit systems. And the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has a list of very specific safety measures. They're looking at where crashes happen and what they are related to. So they will be looking at crashes involving people who are unseat belted, or DUIs, or accidents with young drivers or drivers over 65, things like that. However, while Congress laid out several areas of measurement that they think thought were a priority, they could not agree on every priority. And so what they did was made clear that the states and the metropolitan planning organizations should make sure that they add in any areas that Congress has left out. This is the bare minimum of what they should measure, but if there are local priorities, those local priorities need to be captured by the state the state DOT or the MPO. I will also say that the way the performance measures will work is these measures will be laid out. States and MPOs will set targets under each measure, and then they will report back on whether or not they've met their own targets. So why is access to opportunity an important measure? A lot of the things that we do measure in transportation is trying to get at this notion, the idea that the reason we measure congestion is our fear is congestion is blocking our way to our destinations. But that is not the only thing that can block our access to destination. Sometimes it is the fact that we've only provided one route to that destination. Sometimes it is that we have not provided multiple modes of transportation, and some people don't have access to the mode that you have chosen to provide to your residents. Congestion is a piece of the puzzle, but if you have a high-speed trip that takes a long time, that may not be as good of a trip in your estimation as a low-speed trip that takes a very short time. A 5-minute trip where you travel 20 miles per hour might be highly preferable to a 1-hour trip that takes 60 minutes. Access to opportunity captures the speed, the distance, the fact that you have access by multiple modes, or whether you do or not. It is not ideal if you can only reach essential destinations by one means. There can be an accident, there can be a wreck, a storm, your car could break down. I think about this every day when my husband comes in from the exurbs where he works, trying to race against the clock to get my kids from school. There's really only one route that gets him there, and if there's any wreck along the way, he has no method to get there except through that trip on that road in that car, versus me from my job where if the roads break down, I can jump on the subway, I can walk, I can bike. There's multiple methods to get me to them in a case of an emergency. Why this is so important to measure. Many communities around the country face significant challenges to providing their residents with access to jobs, medical care, daycare, groceries, all those necessities, and this is particularly true for lower income households and economically disadvantaged populations. Low income households often have to go further away from job centers to seek affordable housing options, and the further they go, the more their transportation costs go up, the more isolated they are from the daily necessities they need, and those areas tend to be most poorly served by non-vehicle travel options like transit and non-motorized. And it is especially challenging because as you go far out, development patterns tend to disperse the things that you need, so everything you need is further away, also requiring particularly good connections either through transit or through roads. If we want to build communities with better access, we're going to have to measure where that's happening and our progress towards it, because we tend to invest in what we measure. There's also a growing demand for these walkable communities. In fact, 78% say neighborhood is more important than the size of their house. 57% of people seeking homes would forego a home with a larger yard if it meant a shorter commute. And this is a change from past preferences. It used to be that people really looked for the size of house and they looked for that yard. But now they're saying they want a walkable community. In fact, above average levels of walkability command a premium of $4,000 to $34,000 for a house, just to get above average levels of walkability. Retail and industrial property values also increase with walkability. A 10-point increase in walkability increases property values by up to 9%. So if we don't build more of them, and if we're not measuring the extent to which we have communities that provide people with good access to their daily opportunity or their daily necessities, price pressures will only increase as the demand continues to go up and the supply has remained constrained. So as we move on, I want to take the opportunity to specifically define access to opportunity. Access to opportunity, or we also refer to it as destinations access, is how well the transportation network and land use patterns within a community are enabling all members of the community to reach jobs and other resources and services such as education, healthcare, healthy food, and recreation centers. And we're going to move back and let Rayla talk about some of the things that we have discovered through the development of this guide. The good news is you have some real innovative agencies out in the field that have started work in measuring these areas and have broken some new ground for us so that we can all learn and put it into practice in our areas.
Excellent. Thank you, Beth. So I am going to talk a little bit about the information that's included in the guide to help you figure out which sections to look at depending on what your interests are. And then I'm going to turn things over to Lynne Peterson to close out before our question and answer. As Beth mentioned, there are a number of agencies already starting to look at access to opportunity, measuring it, and not just measuring it, but incorporating the results into their investment decisions and planning decisions. So Lynne's going to talk about a handful of those examples. First, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about our audience for this guide. We really wanted this to be a resource to a broad group of transportation decision makers at a variety of levels within state DOTs and MPOs and local transit agencies as well. So that's a pretty broad audience. And then we also think it might be valuable for other stakeholders who have an interest in how transportation decisions are made and care about this issue of access to opportunity, such as local leaders and policymakers, as well as nonprofit groups and other stakeholders. In designing this guide, one thing that we really wanted to do was help provide a starting point for transportation agencies that want to use access to opportunity to inform their decisions, but maybe aren't sure exactly how to go about it, or they've started to think about it and have hit some sort of roadblock. So this guide outlines some of the benefits, first of all, that Beth talked about of measuring access to destinations and why it's important to do so. It also discusses approaches not just for measuring and tracking access, but actually using that to inform investment and policy decisions. It provides examples of agencies that are already starting to measure this and different ways that they are incorporating that into their decisions. It offers information on the types of data that are needed to evaluate access, as well as tools that are available to help agencies do so more easily. And then it also discusses the role of land use in access, which Beth talked a little bit about, and how to incorporate that into transportation decision making. I'm going to walk briefly through each section of the guide. There are 4. There's an introduction, a section on how to incorporate measures of destination access into transportation programs, a section on approaches and methods for measuring access, and then a section on relevant resources. The first section of the guide provides a lot of the context that Beth just discussed, the types of outcomes that we in transportation have measured traditionally and how MAP 21 and the FAST Act are expanding that, as well as how states can and are starting to look at looking at broader outcomes like access in their performance measurement, as well as other priorities. The section also talks about the importance of considering equity in measuring access, which Beth talked a little bit about, as well as the role of land use. Just a little bit about equity. The discussion of equity is really important for this concept of access. Transportation equity in general refers to whether transportation providers are offering access to affordable and reliable transportation to meet the needs of all community members, particularly traditionally underserved members of communities. And decision makers are placing a growing focus on the need to identify and address some of these disproportionate impacts on access through policies and investments because there are some real disparities. So as the slide says, this is really important to consider when measuring access. While a region might have a good overall accessibility for its population, there may be specific communities that face significant gaps. So it's really important to address that in the performance measurement and within policy and spending decisions. The guide also in the intro talks a little bit about the role of land use, which Beth brought up, which is a huge part of determining how accessible destinations are to the people within a community. In general, for example, when destinations are further away from each other and when different types of land uses are separated, such as residential versus commercial or retail, it can take longer and even be more costly to get from one place to another to fulfill daily needs like going to school, work, groceries. And as Beth said, it also can reduce the number of transportation options available to people. It might take walking between destinations or transit basically off the table. So if someone doesn't have access to a car, they have no real means for getting to certain opportunities or services. There are other aspects of land use that are relevant beyond just the distance between destinations and the mix of destinations. For example, the way that new developments are designed. So this picture, for example, it's a series of medical facilities, and it would be hard to reach them on foot or probably by transit, because even though there is a sidewalk, the facilities are set back so far and separated by the sea of parking. Especially if one were injured, this just wouldn't be a viable option. So all types of land use decisions, from zoning codes to development approval and site plan review, can impact access, and it's really important for transportation decision makers to make land use decision makers their partners in assessing access and addressing it. Through strategies like, citing grocery stores or schools closer to where people live, allowing mixed-use development, putting parking behind the building. A lot of the feedback that we got as we were developing this guide concerned breaking down how a decision maker could go about thinking about how to incorporate accessibility performance measures into their decision making, what steps and considerations they might want to think through. So we created a broad list of considerations, starting with thinking about how measures of access to opportunity will be used to inform decision making, all the way down to developing a methodology and collecting data for measuring this, and then eventually revising the approach over time as circumstances change or data improves. Sections 2 and 3 of the guide are really the heart of the guide in a lot of ways, and they follow this step-by-step process. fairly closely. So Section 2 provides information on how to plan for measuring access and how to think about that, considering how the results are going to be used and using that to define what measures you're going to look at, and then engaging your partners. Section 3 talks about approaches for how measuring access to opportunity can be done through data and tools, and then also talks about implementation strategies like training your staff and, again, adjusting the approach over time. Here's a closer look at what's in Section 2. I'm going to talk about this section for a minute, including starting out by assessing your goals and current barriers up front. That's a really important step. I want to spend a couple minutes, though, talking about options for how places are using accessibility performance measures. Transportation agencies are using accessibility performance measures to inform their decision-making. These are the three areas of transportation decision-making that our guide focuses most heavily on: evaluating scenarios, prioritizing projects, or looking at evaluating different project alternatives during project development. Or at all three of these levels of decision-making, if access is one of several goals or priorities that a state or region has identified and wants to address, developing performance measures tied to those priorities to use at different levels of decision-making, from planning all the way down to projects, can be a great way to actually drive investments toward accomplishment of those goals in a strategic way. I think more and more agencies are looking at this. Though, obviously, at those levels of decision-making, it requires probably slightly different types of performance measures, so there are some conversations that need to happen up front before you can start developing the measures about how they're going to be used. Just a couple more words about each of these, because I think this is one of the most important things that the guide talks about, is different ways that these measures can be applied. Evaluating scenarios, so this is basically something that can be done in long-range planning at that level. A lot of agencies are doing this, especially MBOs. It involves identifying several investment or growth scenarios for the future of the region, ideally including both land use and transportation elements for some of the reasons that we just talked about. Using performance measures for access to opportunity along with other priorities to evaluate how well those scenarios are likely to perform in supporting the priorities you've identified. And then importantly, weighing the trade-offs between those different priorities, because, for example, a scenario might improve access for the region but not perform as well in some of the other priorities that you've identified. So those trade-offs need to be weighed through conversations with stakeholders and partners. And then finally, choosing a preferred scenario. So this is basically the scenario planning approach. And the guide has several examples of agencies that have incorporated access as a criteria in that process, particularly with a focus on equitable access. Prioritizing projects, this practice is a little bit less widespread, though there are more and more agencies looking at performance-based project scoring as the way to select projects. It basically involves setting high-level goals and then identifying measures to go along with them, some of which might be access to opportunities, so performance measures to evaluate and then ultimately score projects based on how they perform how they're anticipated to perform in achieving these priorities. And then prioritizing projects based on their scores. So the guide also has a couple of examples of places that have done this or are doing this that Lynne is going to talk about. And then at the project development level, accessibility performance measures can also be used to evaluate different project alternatives based on how well they will address gaps in accessibility at the regional level or the local and neighborhood level. This is a more granular type analysis, so again, it would require different measures or tools. This might look like a tool that you could use to map proposed transportation improvement and see relative changes in access. So for instance, should we put the new transit stop in this location or that location? Would it do a better job of improving access in one or the other? Is there a major difference? And this is something that I think some agencies are moving toward increasingly, and there are increasingly tools available to help as well. So that's Section 2. That's the type of information that you can find in Section 2 of our fabulous new guide. In terms of the info that's available in Section 3, this provides guidance on how to actually approach measuring destination access, including common data sources and tools. When we think about the types of data necessary to measure access, I think it's useful to think about some of the factors that impact it. Things like the road network and travel speed, transit routes that are available and service frequency, multimodal connectivity, availability of safe, comfortable, relatively direct routes for biking and walking, as well as land use considerations like we discussed, things like the mix and density of destinations, and then also customer considerations like the affordability of the transportation, overall convenience, how long trips take, the things that influence the choices that people make about where to travel, when to travel, what route to take. So there are lots of different types of data that can be used to measure destination access depending on how you focus the analysis, some of which are listed here. Some of these I think are self-explanatory. Demographic data, of course, is essential to helping to provide an equity lens on the analysis. Economic data would be things like employment and other information about the labor market and the economy in a geographic area. A lot of the new tools, or relatively new tools that are available to help measure this, integrate a lot of this data geospatially or geographically so that you can map it and model potential changes and how they would impact things. And then I also wanted to emphasize public engagement is another source of data that shouldn't be overlooked. The data collected through public outreach can really be community members are the foremost expert on their accessibility challenges that they face, so it's important, not to lose sight of that in doing this type of analysis and to bring them in. There is a table in the guide, and I'm sure you can't read this here, which is why I included the page number, but it basically talks about some of the types of data that are commonly used to measure access and typical sources and whether it's freely available. A number of them are freely available national data sets through the census and other means. And data is cited, I think, pretty consistently as one of the biggest hurdles to measuring access, along with other measures that haven't, traditionally been quantified. And it's true that it can be a big challenge, but the guide talks about a lot of agencies that are already, starting to overcome this challenge and how they're doing that. And there are some really good tools out there to help. Speaking of tools, the guide profiles a few of the big ones that are out there, some of which transportation agencies are currently using or have already used to make decisions about their project selection and their planning. Sugar Access and Renaissance Planning Group's tools both have been used by transportation agencies at project level and sort of the broader investment prioritization level. And the guide doesn't endorse any of these tools. We just profile them and talk about, the big ones that are out there and how places are using them. There's another table, which again you probably can't read, but it talks about some of the big ones and sort of the different characteristics of them. And then this section of the guide, section 3, also talks a little bit about what we call proxy measures. So what we mean by that is, based on how we've defined access to opportunity, these performance measures don't quite measure it, but they still get at the concept in some way. And in many cases, they can be a little bit simpler to measure, and there are some free tools available to help. For instance, the Location Affordability Index for transportation affordability is a good tool. Wouldn't help you evaluate possible changes to the transportation network or land use and how they impact access, but it could help you evaluate the current context. So these can be a good starting point if full evaluation of access to opportunity as we've defined it isn't necessarily possible up front. And then finally, we have a section with relevant resources for further reading. I'd encourage you to check it out. These are the categories included in there, and there's descriptions for each, including many of the resources that Wesley mentioned during his brief presentation. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Lynne Peterson to introduce herself and talk a little bit about a handful of the examples that we include in the guide, not all of them, as well as her general experiences as the former acting secretary of the Washington State Department of Transportation. Lynne, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Rayla. Great job, everybody, getting us to this point. The background on me is I started out my career as a Wisconsin Department of Transportation design and construction engineer, and have worked my way through up to being the Secretary of the Department of Transportation for the state of Washington, and now with Smart Growth America. In all of that time, I think what has driven me is that we were trained as civil engineers to be material scientists. When we got into the DOT, we were no longer asked to be necessarily just a material scientist, but a planner, a traffic engineer, a community engagement expert, and none of these things did we actually have training in necessarily. We got it on the job. That on-the-job training in the DOT or in the consulting world basically trained us to know that when we were looking at triggers or outcomes for projects, there were basically three things in the past that we identified: safety, congestion, and economic development. Those were the basic three things that trigger a project and that we were measuring for in terms of outcomes. And then on the backside of a project, the only two things that we really highlighted or even talked about or even followed up with after we actually did the project was basically the measure of success for project delivery on time, under budget. But today, which is why we are talking, is that we live in a much more complicated world than those basic triggers, outcomes, and measures of success for project delivery. When we think about the variety of things that people in the community have wanted to talk about for a very long time, it includes more than that, and it's a very long list: congestion, mobility, public health, accessibility by mode, demographics and geography, safety, safety by all modes, safety for all people, economic development, equity, environmental quality, land use, and quality of life. And just some of the measures of success for project delivery that are changing that we all know, and why we're here today, we have had a lot more discussions in the recent years on upfront costs. How do we get a least cost plan? How do we get a least cost project to those same outcomes? And including life cycle costs, as well as improved outcomes based on all of those triggers for projects that I just mentioned. So that's what's driven me. That's why at WashDOT we kicked off Practical Solutions. We're not only able to get more multimodal aspects into our projects, but find that we were able to cut costs on the delivery of the project by over 40% based on the fact that we weren't over-designing projects, overbuilding projects. We were actually talking about what outcomes we wanted to achieve and designing to those outcomes. So as Rayla said, there are a number of ways transportation agencies can use performance measures specifically for access to opportunity in their decision making. And we'll discuss a few of those at a very high level, and you can read more about them in the guide. First is VDOT, Virginia DOT. On the back end of the project delivery process is financing and project prioritization. And what they have done is created a SMART scale, as you see. The Virginia Department of Transportation recently changed how it prioritizes capital projects in response to state legislation. Under the new approach, VDOT scores all capital projects based on 6 factors. Accessibility is one of those. The other 5 are safety, congestion, environmental quality, economic development, and land use. Each factor has several performance measures associated with it, but for accessibility, the performance measures used are access to jobs, which is weighted at 60%, access for disadvantaged populations, which is again weighted at 20%, and access to multimodal choices weighted at 20%. Projects receive a score from 0 to 100 points and are prioritized based on the results. And the 6 factors are weighted differently in the score for different Virginia regions, allowing for people to have a say in the uniqueness of their region. For example, in large urban areas like the suburbs of Washington, D.C., congestion mitigation is weighted more heavily. In rural areas of the state, economic development is weighted more heavily. This weighting helps to make a statewide scoring process more reflective of those specific regional priorities. VDOT used a tool created by Renaissance Planning to evaluate how well each project performs in the accessibility category. For the next round of project solicitation and evaluation, they are looking at expanding this to look at access to other destinations as well as jobs. In Minnesota, they have started to look at scoring projects in a competitive program as well at the end of the process. But let's recognize that when you start to create project prioritization criteria that are more than we have used in the past, with reverse engineering, every project manager and coordinator knows that you will reverse back to the beginning of the project and know what you're heading towards then in terms of what success looks like on the backside for funding. So the Minnesota DOT used access to opportunity to score projects in a competitive grant program that the DOT ran in 2013. Minnesota DOT used the program called Corridor Investment Management Strategy, or SIMS, to target funding the state priorities unlikely to be addressed through the normal programming process. Under this program, MnDOT evaluated projects based on 3 areas: a benefit cost evaluation, other qualitative factors, and local funding match. While MnDOT assessed common engineering benefits like travel time reliability in its benefit cost evaluation, they also quantified benefits like bicycle and pedestrian related health benefits, noise reduction, runoff, and agricultural land protection. For areas that were difficult to quantify, MnDOT qualitatively considered other factors. One such factor was improved destination access to tourist destinations such as schools, access to things such as tourist destinations, schools, healthcare facilities, and recreation areas. The MTC, which is the next one, has been using performance measures for scenario planning and prioritizing projects as well. We reference the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the San Francisco Bay Area in a couple places in the guide. They are one example of an agency integrating performance measures for access at multiple levels of decision making. The latest update to its regional transportation plan, the Plan Bay Area 2040, MTC developed 3 visioning scenarios combining specific land use patterns and transportation network investments. Each scenario reflected different types of housing, commercial growth, and varying levels of transportation funding. They evaluated each scenario against identified regional goals and performance targets, including several equity criteria to evaluate impacts on specific populations compared to the region as a whole. Some of the accessibility-focused measures used during the scenario analysis included changes to housing and transportation affordability for low-income residents versus the rest of the region, and commute and non-commute travel times for communities of concern versus the rest of the region. This regional land use and travel demand modeling helped MTC perform the analysis. MTC used this evaluation in an extensive public outreach process to select a preferred investment scenario for the entire region. The executive board approved the final preferred scenario in December 2016. It is now undergoing an environmental assessment as required by state law. MTC also conducted a project-level evaluation of potential uncommitted transportation projects using similar performance measures representing billions of dollars in proposed investments. This included a benefit cost analysis and target assessments for major capacity increasing projects and a scoring process for smaller projects. State of good repair investments were also included. Based on this analysis, high-performing projects were prioritized for regional funding, while low-performing projects were subjected to additional analysis. Project sponsors were required to make a compelling case for including low-performing projects in the plan. Medium performers, the majority of projects, were subject to county congestion management agencies' discretion. There are other examples in this guide, and I would encourage you to take a look. But these 3 examples are good examples of folks who have started to provide that kind of performance-based outcome evaluation to their projects at the end of the process, and then reverse engineering back, they are starting to work it into their actual project delivery process. So let me just take a moment from my perspective and give you some of the key lessons learned in implementation from my experience at WashDOT and also in the Portland metro region, where we've been playing around with performance metrics for a very long time. The key, I think, to any of this is knowing your problem statement and having consensus on it, whether it's at the project level or the plan level. You have to be very clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve and getting consensus on that before starting through and creating performance metrics. Because by the time you start creating the performance metrics and evaluating it, you're going to end up with either everybody's still headed in the same direction based on the outcome, or a lot of political riling. You need to allow the time for inclusion of everyone's ideas around the metrics. We have to be sure that we are not just doing community outreach, but we have to be doing community engagement. And engagement means that there's actually empowerment to the citizens that we are working with, and the stakeholders that we are working with, and the thought leaders that we've included, that they see their comments, their thoughts, their needs, their desires included in this type of analysis. And in the end, there's some metric to be able to identify, to be able to follow that thought process through of what they're trying to achieve. There needs to be ownership by the elected officials, stakeholders, and staff, as I said, in the narrowing of those metrics. We need to empower them to be part of the process and take ownership of those metrics at the end. We as engineers, planners, we need to be okay with multiple vague and conflicting goals. It's part of the process. It's part of life. Examples of where we have used the new method before really help, such as this book, this guide. It's going to be very important to be able to pull out examples of what other folks have done, so it doesn't seem so new and cutting edge, and people know that there were good outcomes when it was used. This is probably the most significant lesson learned. We need to provide training, and yet more training to folks, because performance-based outcomes don't come easily. We have an entire system set up to be able to provide projects and do project delivery and fund projects in the old methods with the old metrics. And then we need to actually hold staff accountable from stem to stern, from the entire planning process all the way through to construction and delivery, that we are trying to provide all of these outcomes, including accessibility, to the community that the project sits in and the users of that system, all of the people that use that system. We need to be able to say that we have, in the end, not just provided a project on time and under budget. We need to actually talk about the outcomes that people are going to see on the ground when the project opens, and then track that through time. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Rayla, and we can have some questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn. So as Lynn said, we're going to move into the question and answer portion of our program here. You can continue to type any questions you have in the chat box in the bottom left of your screen. And I believe, to start us off, Beth has received a question.
One question that I've actually gotten a lot is from agencies that are interested in measuring destinations access, but what they say is, we don't have the data to support this kind of measure now. We're interested in moving towards a measure like that, but we don't know where to start. How do we begin? And one of the things I like to remind folks is, it kind of goes back to what Lynn just said, which is that we are not looking for perfection in measurement right off the bat. The best way to learn how to measure things is to try to measure them. And even if you don't start with a perfect measure, you can still gather important information that can help you assess whether or not your investments are getting what you want or what your constituents want out of that investment. What a lot of agencies do is they have a desire to wait until they've got absolute perfection in that measure. And what we found is there is no perfection in any measure. Right now, when we design roadways, we like to look at what the 20-year traffic projection will be. I think when we're honest with ourselves, we all know that our 20-year traffic projections are just best guesses. We don't know what the world is going to be like in 20 years, especially with all the disruptive technologies out there. But we take the information that we've got and we put it together in a way that is reasonable. We can do the same thing here. So we have a lot of resources in this document that talk about data that you can access for free or tools that are available out there. But a lot of times when agencies start to look at this, they realize they're already collecting a lot of the information they need to do EJ analysis or Title VI analysis. And if they just put that information together in a slightly different way, they can provide themselves with some pretty thoughtful guidance about what the state of play is in their region now and how investments could improve that.
So another question that we just received, are there any particular bicycle and pedestrian accessibility measures, including data sources and tools, you can cite which would be useful to state-level agencies? And I'll tack on another question to that I have for both Beth and Lynne, which is what exactly is the state role in measuring and making decisions based on accessibility, given that it's, you know, at its heart really a regional issue? What can the state do to help influence this?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with that second question first, and then Lynne, feel free to break in. This is, people travel locally. People tend to travel, their typical trip is less than 5 miles. So when you're looking at access to their daily needs, those are local trips. And so states need to collaborate as closely as possible with those localities, because that's where the travel is taking place, that's where the land use decisions are made, that's where the housing development decisions are being made. All of that is happening at the local level, and the state needs to be a partner in that. A lot of times, especially in big states that cover a lot of territory, their scope is looking at the connections between communities, and that is extremely important. Our entire federal program was premised on connecting cities and across the country to one another. However, when our taxpayers want to talk to you about whether or not the transportation system is serving them, they're rarely talking about traveling between states or across the country. They're talking about those local trips. So I think particularly in terms of accessing important destinations, the state should be playing a cooperating role with those localities to make sure that all the policies are coming together to connect people with their needs. In terms of bike ped accessibility measures, we talk in the report a little bit about ways to rate bikeability and walkability, like things like walk score. But this is something that your locals are likely to have more access to than states, because these are truly local trips. People don't tend to walk 20 miles on a regular basis. I will say that I've recently seen Washington, D.C. has done an analysis of where all of their bike lanes are, where all of their sidewalks are. They've done an evaluation of every road in the city to determine whether or not each roadway is highly walkable, highly bikeable, moderately so, or not comfortable for those things, as a baseline to then determine how to improve those things. That is not something that every area has done, and you know, is an area that states and localities might cooperate to consider. But bike score and walk score, they look much like the other tools that we talk about here, not just at the presence of destinations close to people, but whether or not there is a safe access between them.
Excellent. Thank you, Beth.
So,
Lynne wants to jump in.
This is Lynne Peterson. Let me just weigh in. From a state perspective, a state DOT doesn't just have one type of facility, and it's not just the interstate. But let's start with the interstate and the fact that every interchange area is either going to increase accessibility or decrease accessibility across the community, because we know that the majority of these interstates cut through communities or are at the edge and actually promote growth beyond them. So as we look at how to discuss accessibility, none of our projects should make the situation worse for pedestrians within a community walking through the interchange area, and it shouldn't decrease, obviously, safety either, because if it increases, if the safety issue increases, then obviously accessibility is also decreased. It's not just that there's a sidewalk, it's that you're actually encouraging, not accommodating, which I think is a really important distinction, because I was taught how to accommodate, and I believe we need to change that terminology to encourage. One of the things that we've been doing in our trainings for practical solutions at Smart Growth America is taking folks for a walking audit of a project that the state DOT doesn't really necessarily have on the books yet, but they've heard that there are issues or they want to take a closer look. So we send groups of 10 people out. They walk the project with folks that are local. If you're using a walking audit as part of big and small projects with community members, they're going to show you the barriers, and they're going to tell you why it's a barrier, right? So you don't even need to have a sophisticated modeling tool. You need to just talk to your community members and find out how many barriers are there. How, include that in the discussion as you move forward as reduction of barriers, whether it be to the transit center, the transit stop, the grocery store, that there's a lot of local traffic in and out of pedestrian bikes as well as vehicular. And then through that interchange area, I think you'd be amazed of how many things you could actually solve at a very low cost that would help everything from ADA to just getting through that interchange and not feeling like the slip ramp traffic is going to kill you every 30 feet. Which we have also seen. The last thing I was going to say is measuring accessibility through some of these sketch tools and things like sugar. They should be part of the background information that you have on your project, because any segment of roadway that's not an interstate is also going to be multimodal in most of our urban areas, big or small. We're going to either have major transit stops or minor transit stops, but there's going to be transit in that corridor. There's going to be bike and ped, and there's going to be a lot of turning movements in and out. And I would encourage you to think about how you're improving accessibility to all modes in that corridor with these tools, so that you're actively participating and engaging your transit agencies in not just the accessibility to their stops, which is where most pedestrians are killed on major state highways that are arterials within the urban area because of block length and signal timing and the width of the street, but also to make sure that you've actually improved the mobility within that corridor, because that is part of accessibility for transit, is the mobility of those transit vehicles within the corridor. If it only comes once an hour and it's always late, it's not really an accessible mode. It's not a usable mode. It's obviously not reliable. So those are just some thoughts between interchanges and corridors. There's a lot to play with in terms of accessibility.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn and Beth, for your insight. We are about at time here, but before we jump off, I wanted to make a quick plug for a technical assistance opportunity that we have available right now here at Smart Growth America and Transportation for America, specifically in this case. For metropolitan planning organizations, we've just launched a competitive application process to do performance measurement technical assistance at either a 101, 201, or 301 level to help MPOs implement performance measures of their choosing, basically, depending on where they are in the process. You can learn more at this link here on the slide. There's also going to be a webinar on March 1st about the application process, which you are welcome to join, and again can learn more about at this link. We'd encourage you to check it out. And with that, Thank you very much for joining us. Again, we're really excited to share this guide with you, and have a great afternoon, everyone.